Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am absolutely delighted to welcome back Dr Owen Emmerson to discuss Hever Castle's brand new exhibition, Capturing a Queen, the Image of Anne Boleyn. Dr Owen Emmerson is a social and cultural historian, a co-author of 5 books, a regular contributor to television documentaries, and is an assistant curator at Hever Castle in Kent. In addition, he undertakes freelance historical consultancy, most recently for BBC's adaptation of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Owen. How are you?
I am very well indeed. Thank you so much for having me back. It's such a joy.
Thank you so much for coming back. And I am so excited to be talking about what we are today, because we're talking about your research on a new exhibition at Hever Castle and the book that accompanies it. So squeal, all fangirls.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy to co-curate this exhibition alongside the wonderful Kate McCaffrey and Alison Palmer, Hever's curator, and to write the book alongside Kate as well. Honestly, it's a dream project that took 4 years, and I loved every second of it, and the ongoing sort of promotion of it too is heavenly.
For anyone that doesn't know you, could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a social and cultural historian by trade. I studied 20th century history for the majority of my time at university. I completed all 3 degrees at the University of Sussex, and I did my doctoral research on the subject of the abolition of corporal punishment in the 20th century. But Tudor history has always been a mainstay of my interest and has become my career. I've spent the last 8 years at Hever Castle, for many of them as the assistant curator. I look after the most beautiful and special collection of 16th century portraiture. And yeah, we've curated a number of exhibitions at Hever now. This is by far the largest and most ambitious of them. But we've got many more to come. We're just starting or have just begun a sort of 4-year plan for what's ahead. So I'm exceptionally lucky to do the job that I love, about a subject I adore, and with people that really get what it is to be a historian. So yeah, I'm blessed.
Where did the inspiration for this research project come from?
This is such a great question. And so it crystallized around 4 years ago, into a sort of a viable exhibition plan. And of course, we do have 4 portraits labelled as Anne Boleyn at Hever, and also several portrait miniatures of her in our collection. But I would say that sort of we've been training for this exhibition for much longer. Obviously, our day-to-day life is looking after these portraits, researching them, building up a body of provenance for the portraiture in our care, because unfortunately Hever lost a considerable amount of its archive in the 1960s during quite a disastrous flood. A big chunk of our job at Hever has been to work with this portraiture base and to recover its lost provenance. But yeah, all 3 of us have had an absolute love of the portraiture of Anne Boleyn for a long time. I think the first image that I ever had of Anne Boleyn was snipped out of a newspaper in September 1988, and it was a very grainy little image of Geneviève Bujold in Anne of the Thousand Days, which I still have because it's very precious. And so, yeah, I think that's where my love of the image of Anne Boleyn started, and I've avidly sort of collected portraits myself, but researched them for many years. And I mentioned that snipping from the newspaper because that was my first image of Anne. You know, that's how I conceptualized her visually. But that shifted considerably over time because of the research that I've done on my own time and extensively since I've been at Hever Castle in the curatorial team. Um, and that kind of was the genesis for this exhibition to not just focus on what we think Anne probably looked like, but also to trace how her image has been conceptualized and shifted over time. And that's an integral part of the exhibition as well. Um, our approach at Hever is to research, absolutely, to find new evidence. That's sort of the bread and butter of what we do. But we're also very conscious that the things that we might discover that compromise previous arguments is also part of Hever's history too. So we have quite a, you know, respectful approach to the history that we're discounting, and we want to make sure that it remains part of Hever's and Anne's story too, because it helps us to explain why things shifted over time. So that's sort of been the genesis of the exhibition, our approach at Hever, and that informed, I think, the shape of the exhibition itself.
What is the obsession with knowing what Anne Boleyn looked like? Why do we really want to know what she looked like?
God, this is such a great question. And if we lived in a different century, I think the answer would be quite different to that which we give today. Um, I think on quite a superficial level in a way. The trend has always been that Anne must have been a great beauty to have A, attracted this king, and B, to have driven him, is the narrative, to discard his first respectful queen and to break with the church in Rome, and to cause this great seismic rupture which affects not just England's history but that of Europe itself. um so the assumption is that she must have been a knockout, this great beauty. And that this is expressed particularly in the Victorian era, when actually Anne garners quite a lot of sympathy. But she is seen as this romantic, beautiful victim. Some authors called her devastatingly beautiful, so beautiful that it was, inevitable that she had to die. Too beautiful in a way. I mean, really interesting ideas about women and power. Um, I think that shifted considerably, thankfully. I think we are seeing Anne through a much um, different lens today. But I have to say, in popular culture, even though we are getting a far more complex and nuanced Anne, actors who play her tend to be incredibly beautiful. And what we try to do with this exhibition is to go back to what Anne's contemporaries actually had to say about what she looked like, and whether or not these assumptions had any basis in reality at all. And we discovered that they don't particularly. She wasn't described as a great beauty. She certainly wasn't described as ugly, or anything like that. But what we can glean, I think, from the contemporary references to her appearance is that they were secondary to who Anne was, to the experience of being with Anne Boleyn and encountering her wit, her intelligence, her charisma, um, the remarkable education that she had. She was widely read, and she read some really radical texts too. She was a keen political player. She was dangerous in many regards. And it's that people talk about most frequently, the experience of being with this woman. So, you know, we've really had to question why it is that the question of Anne's image remains such a popular question, not least by the three curators who curated this exhibition. We're part of that conversation, and I think obviously there has been this assumption, which is actually only rooted in the Victorian era, that all of Anne's portraits were destroyed. There's actually no evidence of that at all. Um, there is this commonly held belief that there's only one contemporary image of Anne Boleyn. Actually, no, there are several others. Um, but also, there is this sort of experience that you have when you are researching Anne Boleyn, that there is so much unknown about her. There are so many gaps in the archive. She's slightly mercurial in that regard. Just when you think you've got her in your grasp, she sort of slips away. So I think people want to know what she looked like, to get to know her better, because frankly, the remaining archive just isn't enough to satiate our appetite. Um, so, you know, chiefly, I think we're also always seeing Anne through other people's eyes. There are far more accounts about her and her behaviour and her actions than there are surviving letters from her, being able to access her in her own voice. So I think that sort of compels us to desire to look through her eyes and not just through other people's. So I think collectively, all of these aspects really sort of make us want to come face to face with her. And I hope in this exhibition we're getting as close as we ever have.
Oh, exciting, exciting. God, I honestly can't wait to go to this exhibition. It's actually ridiculous how excited I am to see your research in
Oh,
it.
bless you. That's so kind.
What contemporary evidence, what images do we have of Anne in her lifetime?
So the one undisputed image that I mentioned just now is a medal that was created in 1534. It's known colloquially as the Most Happy Medal. That was Anne's motto, and it's inscribed on the medal. And we don't know precisely why it was created in 1534. It had been posited by um, Edward Hawkins, who actually owned the medal and who entrusted it to the care of the British Museum, where he worked as a medallogist, um, as perhaps being part of her coronation celebrations. I don't think that quite fits because of the date, 1534 rather than 1533. Some historians have posited that it might be to celebrate the birth of a prince that sadly didn't materialize in that year, but was hoped to. So we don't know quite why it was created. Edward Hawkins did also own another medal, which was he posited was a companion medal, and which depicts Henry VIII. And until recently, we thought that both medals, which are prototypes, they're cast in lead, had never been put into production before. However, very recently, and too late to include in the book, unfortunately, I did acquire a version of the Henry medal that had been dug up in Yorkshire. And it is cast in tin, which tells us a great deal, actually. It is quite clearly also a hat pin. It retains the same dimensions, so it's clearly cast from this prototype. Um, and why I say it tells us quite a lot is that tin is not a precious metal, um, and was most likely therefore worn by a tradesperson, an ordinary person, if you will. Um, and this, I think, gives us just a little window into the function of potentially both of these images, but certainly the image of Henry. that they were to be distributed at quite a volatile time in Henry and Anne's life, um, during the tumultuous period where Henry is breaking with the church in Rome. And therefore, they serve a purpose. They're probably a bit of PR to bolster both Henry and Anne's image at quite a fragile time. So that's been really exciting, and I'm so pleased to say we do have the medal on display as part of the exhibition, which is just glorious. And it's in quite a beautiful shallow case that we had made. It's displayed next to a portrait miniature of Anne. So you can get really quite close to both of them. And for me, it's, just a magical, magical experience to be able to include it in the exhibition. Um, there are other images of Anne that were created during her lifetime. There is a image which is included in the Black Garter book and which was identified by Roland Huy. It is an allegorical, I guess you could say, depiction of Philippa of Hainault, which Anne has been used to depict. She has an AR medallion on her, and this fits with the use of Henry's image for other kings in the Black Garter book as well. So it's a fairly crude image, I'm going to be honest. It doesn't really tell us much about what Anne looked like, but very interestingly, like the Most Happy Medal, she is wearing a bonnet and frontlet or an English gable hood. Um, which is a nice counter to this very modern idea that Anne only wore the French hood. Her inventories and descriptions of her apparel counter this too. So she absolutely wore both fashions. There is also an image of Anne that was created for her coronation banquet. It's essentially a seating plan in Westminster Hall just after her coronation. And again, this is a very, very crude image of Anne. She is holding two scepters, and she's also crowned, most likely wearing the lighter crown that was fashioned for her coronation, which most likely was also worn by her daughter Elizabeth after St Edward's crown was removed from her head. So that one is a firm favourite of mine. But we are arguing in this exhibition that the sketch by Hans Holbein the Younger, the Windsor sketch, is a contemporary likeness of Anne Boleyn. Moreover, we are reaffirming that Wenceslas Holler's engraving of St Barbara, which came from the Arundel collection, where the Holbein sketches were held, is also a full-length depiction of Anne Boleyn. And the research that I did with Kate to put together an argument for that was incredibly exciting. There is also another image that I had the incredible pleasure of working on with the historian Jessica Carey Bunning. It was created in 1533, again for Anne's coronation. It's a piece of propaganda. It's a pamphlet that was put out again for the consumption of, in inverted commas, ordinary people, to get some support behind the events of the coronation, to describe the events in quite amazing detail. It was printed by Wynkyn de Worde, and it survives in the British Library. And on the cover, previously, this woodcut had been dismissed as a generic court scene. But Jessica and I are arguing that it actually shows Henry and Anne in three different versions of their relationship. To the left, we see them in courtship. At the centre, we see them getting married, their betrothal and marriage. And to the right, we see both Henry and Anne enthroned, raised on a dais, and both of them wearing crowns, with Henry's hand on her abdomen, clearly showing that she is heavily pregnant, which Anne was at her coronation. So yes, we're arguing that also, in addition to that, that the Hornbout miniatures, one of which is held in the collection of the Duke of Buccleuch, and the other, which is in a museum in Canada, in Ontario, are also probably, most likely, the earliest known painted images or any image of Anne Boleyn to survive. We're arguing that they were likely created in around 1527 and were likely betrothal portraits. They're in These miniatures are entirely consistent with the face that we see in the Windsor sketch, and therefore, collectively, this corpus of portraits that were created during Anne's time give us a really, really solid understanding of what she looked like. And I actually think she's really quite good looking, contrary to many people's opinions about these portraits. I'm really very fond of them indeed. But more importantly, they are remarkably complete. You know, if we compare Hans Holbein's beautiful preparatory drawing, and then we consider Wenceslas Holler's engraving of what was the final version created by Holbein, this allegorical image of Anne as St. Barbara. If we throw in the mix those beautiful, delicate but intricate Hornbout miniatures, which are again are entirely consistent and also match with the Most Happy medal, we really have quite a complete picture of what Anne looked like. And for me, that journey of discovery and reaffirmation um, has been really exciting. And I hope that people find the evidence we've compiled compelling.
That is honestly so exciting because when it comes to trying to think of images in Anne Boleyn's lifetime, it's always like there's none. There's just none. So
Yeah.
for you to say there's loads, it's actually a bit mind blowing. Actually, it's
Yeah. No, no, totally. And what I can also say is that I think because there has been such a um sort of a move against some of these images, um, chiefly because people don't think that she's beautiful enough, or they can't understand why the king would break with Rome for a woman who has, God forbid, a double chin. Um, that actually I think it's obscured our ability to understand and to locate other images that are likely of Anne. And I do think there are more out there. And perhaps we've been looking for the wrong face. Perhaps we've been looking for the wrong hair color. Perhaps we've had the wrong expectations of this woman's image. And I'm really excited for the future. We've been very, very candid throughout this process that this is not the final word on the image of Anne Boleyn, and it's a discussion, hence why we have encouraged our visitors to consider all of the evidence and also to have their say. We have a voting mechanism at the end where people can say which pattern they believe both best represents Anne from the evidence we've given. So this is a conversation and one that I'm really privileged to be a part of.
during your research. Obviously, you've mentioned that you've come across some new contemporary images. Have you come across any images in later centuries?
Yeah, no, definitely so. And one of the things I've been most excited about is to really try to pin down how Anne's image evolved in Elizabeth's reign. Of course, we've known for a long time now that the famous National Portrait Gallery portrait, catalogued as MPG 668, is Elizabethan. And we know that a number of portraits survive from that period or are closely related to that portrait. In fact, across my research, I found in excess of 25 different panel portraits that are likely from the 16th century, and likely two from Elizabeth's reign. So, quite a body of B pattern portraits. And I'm thrilled to say that we have 11 of them on display in the same room all together. And we've done this to demonstrate that, yes, they are so alike. This is a woman shown consistently throughout in a black court gown with a French hood. with gold ouches interspersed by double rows of pearls. She has pearls around her hood. In some regards, it might seem like the same portrait, but actually they're so similar and yet so different. And we've been able to actually divide them quite neatly into two distinct patterns. One, which we are arguing preserves the face not of Anne, but of her daughter, Elizabeth, building on the work of Sir Roy Strong, who first posited this in the 1960s, and then laterly the work of Claire Ridgway and Sylvia Barbara Soberton, who also worked upon this theory. We've been able to expand upon that considerably using the work of Lawrence Hendra, who's actually identified the artist who created the National Portrait Gallery portrait. And there are other portraits by this artist, one of Elizabeth, the Compton Verney portrait, one of Mary I, the Vice Gallery portrait, and also one of Edward IV, the Fitzsimmons portrait. And we discovered that they all retain Elizabeth's face pattern. So we're slightly arguing against the theory put forward by Soberton that there was no portrait of Anne Boleyn in Elizabeth's reign, so they borrowed Elizabeth's face. That doesn't account for why Mary's face also contains Elizabeth's pattern, why Edward IV's face also contains Elizabeth's pattern. Anne Boleyn should look nothing like her stepdaughter and her daughter's paternal great grandfather. So I don't think that theory quite stands anymore. So we've tried to explore why it is that Elizabeth's face would be mapped not just onto her mother's face at this time, but also to her half sister Mary's and onto Edward IV as well. And 1584, when the National Portrait Gallery was created, is a really sort of seismic time for Elizabeth. She's no longer of childbearing age, sadly. The last person who she had a reasonable prospect of marrying, the Duke of Alençon, has died. The Throckmorton plot has been uncovered, which essentially acted on the Pope's command when he excommunicated Elizabeth, that her subjects should overthrow her in favour of a Catholic monarch, Mary Queen of Scots. This is a time when Elizabeth's life is being threatened, and she can't look forward as a promise to secure her throne. She can't provide legitimacy through a living heir. And therefore, we argue that she looks to her past to visually demonstrate her legitimacy. Now, this is something that, of course, might seem natural. Her mother was executed for adultery. There had been questions abound about the paternity of Elizabeth, and her half sister Mary had propagated the idea that Mark Smeaton, not Henry VIII, had been her father. So, what better way of refuting those claims than by showing a link visually between the Queen and many of her ancestors? This, I think, was a visual way of strengthening her throne by looking backwards to her heritage and saying, yes, Elizabeth is legitimate. Of course, of course she's illegitimate. She looks like her half sister. She looks like Edward IV. So yes, I think this was a slightly blunt tool, but I think it speaks volumes about the time that these paintings were created.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've seen the National Portrait one, and it's so alike to Elizabeth. You go, when you look at it from distance, you go, God, didn't they look alike? And then you think, is that done on purpose? Because Elizabeth would have been fragile about her status because it was always so contested.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And, this argument has really evolved from Sir Roy Strong's argument that, this was likely a borrowing of a face into, I hope, a deeper understanding about why And I'm not convinced that we can say anymore that it's because there was no likeness of Anne to work from. I don't think that holds water anymore. So I'm hoping that through Lawrence Hendra's research, we've provided some kind of answer. That answer might be refuted in the future, and we welcome that because we really want to understand why it would be that Anne's face has evolved so dramatically during the reign of her daughter. It had a utility. Her face had a utility. Her memory and the power of that memory had a utility to Elizabeth.
How does Anne's image change over time? And I mean this compared to when her daughter's life and when you see the Victorian era where she's more like romanticized and rosy cheeked.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how quickly her image shifts. And I think, it's definitely during Elizabeth's reign that she is recast not as a victim, but as a central player in the creation of the Church of England. There is a huge revision of her memory. Elizabeth can't ignore her mother. Tracy Borman, the wonderful Professor Tracy Borman, has utterly refuted this idea that Elizabeth did not speak about Anne Boleyn. There are countless examples that Tracy has so beautifully demonstrated. Moreover, she adopts her emblems. During her reign, a myriad of portraits of Anne emerge and begin to fill the corridors of her courtiers. So, there, as I said, there's a utility to Anne. She can't ignore what happened. She also can't criticize her father for what happened either, certainly not publicly. And therefore, she has to do things a bit more subtly than Mary the First did. All of her legitimacy comes via Henry and in spite of Anne, essentially. But her actions are very revealing. She restores her mother as queen. There's an effigy of her very publicly at her coronation, and we have this multiplication of images of Anne throughout Elizabeth's reign. Um, Now, of course, without Elizabeth as a stakeholder, I think there isn't this sort of need to portray Anne in a particular way when she dies. But Anne's memory certainly doesn't die, and she evolves wonderfully. And I would highly recommend the work of Stephanie Russo and Susan Bordeaux, because they have explored the afterlife of Anne Boleyn in wonderful complexity. Um, but by the time we get to the Victorian era, I think there is a need to see Anne in a particularly romantic light. And in part, I think it is driven by Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria actually visited Hever Castle as a princess. We know about this because she wrote about it quite enthusiastically in her journal. And I think it had a lasting impression upon her. Um, One thing that really struck me is she called her poor Anne Boleyn, and that's a totally understandable sentiment, but I think it's expressed much more widely in um, the visual culture of Anne Boleyn at the time. And I think Victoria was so taken by her story. I mean, she famously sketched the actress who plays her in um, the opera that was very popular at the time of Anne Boleyn's life. And she actually based her state robes on the costume worn by that actress, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. Prince Albert used to commission very romantic images, miniatures of Anne Boleyn. But more broadly, Victoria also oversaw the bringing back into the royal collection of many items that had belonged to Anne. So I think there is a sort of a personal admiration for this woman. She, of course, oversees and gives license to the exhumation of what is then believed to be the remains of Anne Boleyn at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Um, so a huge amount of sort of cultural work is done during the Victorian era. And I do think, the Strickland sisters, for example, who create very popular histories of Anne, um, are also an integral part of conceptualizing Anne, yes, as a key political player, but also as something of a romantic heroine, a tragic heroine. And we really see the multiplication of Anne in popular culture as this character at this time as well. And that sort of feeds right through the 20th century. Um, I think that only really shifts sort of in the 60s and 70s when we get a much more complex picture of her. So she does shift because I think she means different things to different people according to their understandings of what a woman in power looks like. Um, and that's, I think, why she shifts so dramatically over time.
Do you include anything Anne Boleyn owned in the exhibition?
We do, and we do this for a very particular reason because our visitors essentially are being asked to walk back in time from the Victorian era, and we're inviting them to try and peel back the layers of polish, shall we say, or tarnish, if you want to be a purist, and to understand how that beautification was applied to her, and to sort of peel back those layers to get to the real image in inverted commas of Anne. Um, and I hope that's a journey that people really appreciate going on because I found it, very exciting to journey through myself. But we came to the conclusion, having done all of that work, that the most important aspect to Anne Boleyn in terms of image was not necessarily her portraiture. And we do think that was important to her. I think we have good evidence of that. And in fact, I think she understood the utility of public and private portraiture very astutely indeed. When you consider that the Most Happy Medal and the pamphlet was for public consumption, and had a very particular function. Whereas the Windsor sketch was really quite private and intimate, and so were those Hornbout miniatures. This is a woman who really understood the function of image in terms of portraiture. However, we came to the conclusion that equally important, if not more, to Anne was the image constructed by the use of heraldic devices and aspects of iconography. So we are thrilled to say that we have the carved falcon that was discovered by Paul Fitzsimmons on display, alongside her secondary emblem, also discovered by Paul Fitzsimmons, which is a leopard head. We're so grateful to Paul for loaning those two items alongside an item which has never been exhibited before, which the wonderful Sandra Vasoli has been researching on, and that is a chair from the 1518 to 1520 period that likely came from France. Um, we also have the cup from the Cirencester Church, which has Anne's falcon atop, known as the Boleyn Cup. We also have a missal box on loan from Leeds, which is reputed to have been Anne's. So we've got all of these on display near to Anne's manuscript Book of Hours. And very, very excitingly, we also have Anne's copy of Ecclesiastes, which is graciously on loan from the Duke of Northumberland at Hever Castle. And this is a thing of real beauty. It's one of the few books that Anne owned that is in its original cover. It's covered in black velvet and has beautiful gilt bosses on the front, which contain not only her arms, but the emblems of England and her crowned white falcon. But inside, which our visitors will be able to see after a few months of the cover being on display, we're going to be opening it up because Gerard Hornbout illuminated this book to an extraordinary level. It contains all of Anne's known mottos, the most happy, etc. And all of her emblems, we have the honeysuckle and acorn, the marital emblems of Henry and Anne. Um, we have more falcons inside. We have her arms. It is, I would argue, the most complete visual expression of Anne's identity that remains. And it's an absolute joy to have it on display amid all of these other items, which speak not to a destruction of Anne's belongings, as has been maintained, but a recuration of them. And this absolutely chimes with what we see in Henry VIII's inventory when he dies. We see a plethora of belongings that Anne left behind, because Henry did not destroy them. There was no mass destruction. There was a recuration because he saw utility in Anne's belongings long after he saw no utility in her.
It's just so amazing that you and Kate and Alison have been able to get all of these objects and portraits together. What is it like seeing it all together?
Really overwhelming. And yeah, thank you for saying that because it was a lot of hard work. We're a small institution. We're quite a famous one. He was very well known. But there's only three of us in the curatorial department. And yeah, so we had to oversee all of those loans between us. And I'm a consumer as much as anything. And um, all of these loans sort of arrived individually on different days and were installed. But the first time that I was able to walk through and see them all together was incredibly emotional. Um, and it's probably something I'll never get to do again. I do see this certainly for Hever as a once in a generation or lifetime exhibition. I've never seen so many things depicting or relating to Anne Boleyn together before. And believe me, I've attended most things that relate to Anne Boleyn. Um, so I found it really overwhelming, and I'm really hoping that people who are able to come um, get a sense of what this woman was, because there's so much of her left behind in it, so many unanswered questions. And I, one of my real hopes for this exhibition is that we can encourage the custodians of belongings, portraits, to do the kind of research that we've been privileged to be able to do on our panel portrait of Anne Boleyn at Hever, to apply new science and to get a much better understanding of how these paintings were created, when and how, and why. Um, and I hope, this exhibition is something of a catalyst for that process, because before I breathe my last, I'd love to know precisely how old each and every one of the known panel portraits of Anne Boleyn is. Um, because there are many that we know existed, which we can account for no longer. And only four of those many panel portraits of Anne have undergone any kind of scientific analysis. So I'm hoping it expands the conversation and then we start getting more answers, because I think she's worth it.
Obviously, you just talked about how some portraits have gone for analysis, and obviously, the iconic Hever Rose portrait went for
Yeah.
analysis. What were the results of that?
Oh, it was so exciting. And our panel portrait, which is very famous, went off to the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge, after going through a process of dendrochronology by the wonderful Ian Tyers, who dated the panel rather to 1583, just a year before the National Portrait Gallery portrait, making it the oldest known panel portrait that's been tested to survive so far. Um, Now, I have already mentioned, but just to caveat that with, there's only four that have been tested. So chances are there's an older one out there. it could be that one dates much closer to Anne's lifetime, even to her lifetime. So, this work is really important. But the wonderful Paul Van Laar, the technical art historian at the Hamilton Carr Institute, was able to apply dendrochronology to see beneath the layers of paint. Also, paint analysis was completed, confirming that the pigments used were entirely consistent with the date of the panel. So we knew we had an original painting and not something that was added later. But the infrared reflectography really showed us something extraordinary. Firstly, it confirmed a very strong, stable outline, fully consistent with the transference of a pattern. That confirmed to us that this wasn't an original composition, and therefore there had been an earlier version of it, which inches us again slightly closer to Anne's lifetime. This was based on a pre-existing portrait, which is very exciting. The other thing that was noted is a pintamento, a change in the composition. Originally, the artist had depicted Anne's arms disappearing off the bottom of the panel, but then they changed their mind. They sketched in Anne's hands, and very unusually, all 10 of her fingers. And this, remarkably, because of the dating, backs up the wonderful Helen Harrison's theory that the hands on this portrait were added to refute the slander that was being put out to counter Elizabeth by Nicholas Sander, the recusant Catholic, that Anne had a deformed hand, that she had 6 digits on one of her hands, and we're arguing that this is again part of that defense of Elizabeth, rather like the National Portrait Gallery version, but in a different form. This is a visual refutation of that slander that's being propagated by Sander to undermine Elizabeth via her mother. So really glorious, exciting findings, and it was such a joy to be able to be at the Hamilton Carr Institute to look beneath the layers of paint that I've stared at for far too many hours, and to see for the first time since the artist had covered it in paint, that underdrawing. um I'll never forget that. It was amazing.
I think it's so incredible, and I completely agree with you. It's so important to do this testing if we can, because it gives us a new perspective and it gives us a new idea of what they were doing. Like the hands, it's like that is a big fu to Sander, really, isn't it? It's
Yeah, it
like
really is. Yeah, it's exactly that. And there are some really exciting examples in the exhibition. One of my absolute favorites is the Lyndhurst portrait, which has come all the way from New York. And really excitingly, we've been able to conserve 5 of the portraits that are on display, including cleaning them. And some really exciting results have come from that process. Not only are they looking spectacular and have so much more definition now that layers and layers of centuries worth of dirt have been removed, but pretty much all of them have red hair or auburn hair, which is really exciting. And we are arguing that Anne probably didn't have jet black hair, as Nicholas Sander was the first to claim, but probably, like her daughter, was something of a redhead, which is an exciting thing for us to conclude. Um, Moreover, science sort of backs that up, because to give birth to a redhead child, both parents have to carry the MC1R gene. Now, they don't have to be dominant carriers, but having that gene increases the likelihood of the parent being a redhead. So, yeah, that was something that we weren't necessarily expecting as an outcome. Um, but really excitingly as well. So, for example, with the Lyndhurst portrait, which is absolutely beautiful, they were able to confirm that it had been over cleaned at one point, and previously therefore had a considerable amount of overpaint on that portrait. Um, and this backs up Lee Porritt's theory that the Lyndhurst portrait is that which was photographed in the Howard Young galleries, um, but with overpaint on it in that photograph. So it's really exciting that, this process of cleaning and conservation is starting to give answers to some of the theories that have been wonderfully put forward by art historians and historians across the past few years. Um, so yeah, it's wonderful to see them all looking beautiful, and also to have a role in conserving them for the future because they matter.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm just trying to get over, is Anne Boleyn an Auburn girl? I'm
Yeah.
trying to get over that. Because
Yeah.
that shifts, like, I see Genevieve Bujold straight away when I think of Anne
Yeah.
Boleyn. So that's like uh, that shifted my perception completely.
Totally. But really interestingly, if you look at that film in high definition, Genevieve has like flashes of red in her
Mm.
hair. And that's probably something like Anne. She probably, was on the darker side of Auburn, but had that sort of electric flash of red that sort of danced around in the light. So yeah, really exciting.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a history pet peeve?
Oh, that's such a good question. Um, I think it's just a professional one, to be honest, and that's the idea that we can't be questioned and that we gain a sense of ownership over a subject. And I say that with the greatest respect because people do the most remarkable, lifetime studies into certain areas. But my wonderful friend Alfred Hawkins always says the mark of a good historian or archaeologist or any kind of professional is the ability to change one's mind. And what we know about history changes all the time. And I think we have to have the ability to look afresh at new evidence when it emerges, to listen to new theories when they are posited, and to change our minds accordingly. And it's something of a pet peeve when expertise is offered up to sort of become a barrier between what should be a fluid conversation. I don't want to downplay people's achievements by any stretch of the imagination because, as I say, people do gain expertise. Um, but part of that expertise is the ability to listen and to revise. Um, yeah, that's probably one of my only pet peeves, I think.
No, you're completely right. Because for me, history is all about perspective, and everyone else's perspective. I could have a completely different view on Anne Boleyn to you, but you still got to respect each other's opinions and what you see from that side of history.
So true. And these people are sadly long dead, and they haven't given us the authority to be the spokesperson for their life. They really haven't. And therefore, there should be no gatekeeping, I don't think, um, certainly not implemented by us.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Oh, that's such a great question. Just one person.
No, you can. I'll let you. You can have a few if there's a few that
Okay,
are in your
okay,
mind.
okay. Um, Obviously Anne, that goes without saying. Um, Peter Wildeblood. He was quite a remarkable individual who I studied during my undergraduate degree. He wrote a very courageous book called Against the Law in the 1950s, which argued against the criminalization of homosexuality. And I'd love to have a good chat with him. Um, Rosa Lewis, uh, who's not a household name anymore, um, but she was a remarkable woman. She happened to be the executive chef at Hever Castle during Astor's time. And she was also mistress of King Edward VII. She had a very, very colourful life indeed. And I've been obsessed with her for many years. So yeah, she'd absolutely be on my guest list too.
Be quite an interesting dinner table. Everyone's got a big topic they'd each discuss.
Yeah, I'm not convinced they'd all get on. But that would be even more fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah. If you could meet Anne Boleyn and ask her one question, what would it be and why?
Oh, oh my goodness. Just one question. Oh, um, I'd probably be so starstruck and in awe and also slightly terrified, I think, that I'd probably ask her something really stupid. Um, so I'll try not to do that now. I'd probably ask her to describe like her the most important day of her life because hopefully it would lead to a long answer. um, Rather than, the obvious, which would be like, when were you born? Um, because that would just lead to a date and my time would be up. So yeah, I'd probably ask her to describe like the most important day of her life, and hopefully it would be a 10-hour answer, and I can make copious amounts of notes and stuff like that.
That's quite a good question, actually. I'm sorry to put you on the spot with that question.
No, not at all. It's a great one. It's a great one.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
Again, um, it probably would be one of the Christmases that I know that the Boleyns were all together at Hever. And to my count, there were several of them. And actually, I'm probably going to get a bit of stick for this, but it wouldn't be one of the like momentous ones. Um, I'd quite like to see them just en famille at Hever, all together. Not particularly because it's Christmas, but that tends to be when families are together, as is today. Um, yeah, I just want to spend a day with them and observe and to learn what their life was actually like and what was important to them and how they interacted with each other and whether or not they got on each other's nerves. Because they. Probably did at times. So yeah, nothing flashy. I mean, I'd love to see the coronation and things like that, of course, but I think probably you're not seeing you're seeing massive amounts of spectacle, but not necessarily. Uh, wouldn't necessarily tell you a lot about their character because they're on public display and they're putting on a performance. So it would definitely be an everyday day at Hever Castle. Um, Hopefully with lots of boring bits and how people respond to that as well, and what their servants did, and um, yeah,
No.
did they snore?
Yeah. Who was the noisiest out of the family?
Yeah, definitely.
And finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
Whew, gosh, have I got a favorite historical fact? Um, yeah, my house was a brothel during the Second World War.
Interesting.
Yeah, and when I was working for the Sussex University Archive, throughout all three of my degrees, I spent a long time looking into the history of my house because I love big histories. Don't get me wrong, but I also love micro histories. I love looking at one place and trying to understand how history passed it by and the role it played in a local environment. And yeah, one of the things that I discovered was its very colourful history of servicing the local army camp, which was stationed nearby. And yeah, I loved reading all the police reports on all of the goings on in my house. Yeah,
All series 4, possibly, but on your
definitely.
house.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming back and talking to us about your meticulous research and the wonderful exhibition. And of course, I urge everyone to go and see it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. And I hope those of you who are able to see the exhibition enjoy viewing it as much as Kate Allison and I enjoyed putting it together. It was a joy and an honour. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.